Asia and Europe fighting for the first time. Here is the goddess-worshipping culture who worshipped Aphrodite and Apollo, which was Troy, falling out with the patriarchal Greeks under Agamemnon from Mycenae, who thought the king's word is very important and you should just do what he says. It was silly. It should have been mediated, and I, as a peace druid, would have tried to get the two sides around the campfire, give them all some excellent wine, and get some common stories being told. And in fact, I wrote several poems when I was at Troy, and I'm going to share a couple of them as we go along. I'm going to share first this poem, which I wrote in crossing the Hellespont, in fact, on my way to Troy. I should say also, for my friends that are interested in the history of the area, that this is also where the Dardanelles campaign took place in World War I, when thousands of Anzac soldiers, Australian and New Zealanders, died trying to capture a few bits of beach only a few miles from Troy. I mean, I was amazed. From the hill at Troy, you can see the Dardanelles, and you can see where this terrible campaign took place. It was Churchill's silly idea. He thought that if we captured that bit of beach and the hills inland, we would then build a bridgehead and could march on Istanbul and knock Turkey out of the war in a few months. Arrogance, hubris, because the Turks happened to have a huge army and were well defended. They knew the land. They had machine guns. So when the Australians and New Zealanders land on the beach off this huge fleet, they just mowed them down. And if you haven't seen, there's some brilliant movies about this. The chap that starred in Gladiator, one of my favourite actors, he's made a movie about the Gallipoli landings. And there are other films about this. Gallipoli is just within, like, shouting distance almost of Troy. So I was thinking how extraordinary that we go from battles over this terrain in the early Bronze Age down to the 20th century. I live for a world where these wars will no longer be needed and where we can live in peace. So here is a little poem, Crossing the Hellespont. We walk on the sea of the gods. We skim on the lake of the absolute. We drown in the love of the taste. We float on an ocean of faith. We tremble on waves of desire. We float on the billows of ecstasy. We sail on the ships of our minds. We dock with the certainty of doubt. It's just a short poem because I wrote it literally as the ferry was crossing the Hellespont. I'd come from Istanbul by a deluxe coach, and it took you to Çanakkale, which is a beautiful town. I hope I've got some pictures of it to share with you. And then I stayed there, and then you get to go to Troy. It's a bus ride from Çanakkale, and it was on the ferry crossing to Çanakkale that I wrote that poem, literally as the ferry riding. Okay, so there's another look at. There's one particular building, they call it the Aristocratic Residence. What was it? Was it sort of castle? Is that where Priam lived? There are still many unanswered questions, but the great archaeologist Manfred Corner, who worked there on it, he married a Turkish girl, and he left his entire library to the people. And I was fascinated to see that he left the library in Çanakkale. So I spent the whole day in Çanakkale in the library. I've got photographs of that to show you. And it was amazing to be amongst his own book collection, because you can tell a person from the quality of their books. And this archaeologist was, to die for, important. I could tell. Let's see if we can find that. There's lots of different photographs. I would love to share them all, but I'm not going to have time for everything. Let's see what we can find. There's a visit to Antalya and Konya, which I did in Turkey. That's a visit to Cordoba. I might come back to that if there's time. Okay, here's the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. Let me show you some of the treasures that I managed to find there, which I photographed, all which had mostly come from Troy, a lot of them. I mean, this is one of the greatest museums in the world. I believe this is probably Nebu. I talked about him earlier, the god of scribes, one of my intellectual heroes, so to speak. He's got that Nebo look. Yes, and there he is with the writing on his. He was the scribe of the gods. He would, he was a god himself who kept the minutes of the meetings. And you've got to remember, this museum in Istanbul is from the Ottoman period, when they owned most of the Middle East. And so they were having finds dug up all over the Middle East, Iraq, and Syria and Palestine and all over, and even in Arabia. And they were then bringing them back to this great museum. It's really on a par with the British Museum, if not, well, for Middle Eastern fans, it's even better. And it takes ages to look around. It has so many treasures. So much to share that I don't think we're going to have time, sadly. What have we got here? Let's have a look. That might be some kind of early writing, perhaps. Yeah, so the history of writing, the early scripts, the alphabet, they're all here. To die for if, like me, you're a fan of writing and the history of scholarship. That's a model that's there of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, great palace of wisdom, named after Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, so to speak, in the Christian faith. This is when the Ottoman Empire had all these territories. So a lot of the finds are all here in this museum in Istanbul. That's if you haven't been there, have a look. Glass was invented in Syria, Palestine, and so they have a tremendous collection of early glasswork. Okay. So that's only a little glimpse, sadly. There isn't time to do justice to the wonders there. That looks to me like a Roman empress of some kind, possibly a goddess, could be Demeter. Because, of course, Syria and all over, and the whole of Anatolia were an essential part of the classical world. And so there's huge numbers of classical statues of gods and goddesses. Lucian, the great satirist and philosopher, wrote about a pilgrimage he made to the city in Syria where the goddess was based, Astarte, who was also the goddess of Galilee. It's an intriguing probability that Jesus would have known all about Astarte, who was believed to manifest in fish form. And it's interesting that the early Christians from Galilee worshipped, I believe, the goddess in the in that form, but discuss. And in my commentary on the Gospels, I've gone into all that. I think Christ was much more cosmopolitan and well educated than people realise. They kind of want to make out he's a country bumpkin who came from a place where nobody thought about anything but fishing. I think that's completely wrong. Galilee was a highly sophisticated place with a profound knowledge of all the gods of antiquity and the goddess, trying to reconcile this with the Hebrew Bible, which was, to their eyes, somewhat limiting, a slight reduction down from the universality that they were used to. And and they also knew about Atargatis, the goddess of Syria. And old Lucian went to her temple and wrote about the pilgrimage. So, and Hume apparently was reading that book by Lucian when he died. Hume, although he's called a skeptic, was actually quite an intelligent man. He was a historian after all. And people forget that these great scholars also, are interested in finding the truth. I mean, the truth is what matters. Hume just developed skepticism as a methodology to get to the truth, just as the Jains did. Okay, so that's just a tiny glimpse of, I spent a whole day in that museum in Istanbul and a whole day going around the amazing site of Troy. Let me show you a couple of other places I visited on the same trip, because they are also profoundly interesting. So I want to show you this, which is the library, as I said, of the great scholar. I was there in 2014. These are just some glimpses of his collection. Manfred Corner, who was the archaeologist behind the discoveries of what we know about Troy now. He took over from what earlier generations of archaeologists did, but he was able to add tremendous detail. So these are photographs I made of the books. If you don't know me by now, you probably know I'm a bit of a bibliophile. And so I will photograph books if they're rare. I'll probably never get back to this library in my life. And I'll never meet Manfred Corner, who's dead, sadly. But I can access my memories through studying the books that he loved, and then he left as a gift to the Turkish people. And it's open to anyone that wants to visit, in normal visiting hours. And he was an archaeologist based at a university in Germany who, these are typical of Celtic finds. This is Gavrinus, the tomb shrine in Brittany. Look at the incredibly complex artwork here. There's a vulva sign, according to Maria Butas. I think he had a collection of Butas's works, which I was able to photocopy. And this is mind-blowing. This is the Civilization of the Goddess by Butas, which Manfred Corner loved, as I do. I'm sure if we'd have met, he would have really had an interesting conversation with me. You can tell somebody by their library. And so, this, you see, the point I'm making here is that the Druid culture of Brittany, of Gaul, of Western Europe, and of Britannia and Ireland was the same culture as the culture at Troy and the culture in Greece. There is a continuity. We're taught they're all separate, but I think that's because we project back onto them our own separatist nationalisms. In fact, the cultures of the world, the sages of all these cultures knew that there is a divine unity underlying it all. This is in Thessaly. Look, 6000 BC, right? They were building these houses. They had ovens with clay, and they were, sophisticated people. This is Butas, is what she calls Old Europe. Well, Old Europe is what became the Celtic civilizations of Europe. And it became the Greek civilization. It became the Etruscan civilization. And it became the civilizations of Anatolia. And it became the city-states of Miletus and Ephesus, which I'm going to show you in a minute, because I also visited there on this trip. So here's a wonderful map. These are all from the collections of our dear departed archaeologists who discovered Greece. These are some of the earliest sites they've found. And of course, Delphi is right in the middle of them, here near Elatia. And that's why I'm committed to reviving the Delphic Games, because they're a sort of a quintessence, a flourishing of the best of that ancient world, the world of old Europe. It grows into the culture that gave us Delphi. Delphi was already an oracular site in about 3000 BC, and it had a continuity onwards. I mean, what an amazing volumes to have. Sasson, Civilizations of the Near East, 4 volumes. Anyone that wants to make a donation to my library, we can get these books, and that'll be lovely. Yeah. So anyway, it was to die for this visit, and I just went. To me, this is my idea of heaven. I think some of you that know me realise I'm headed for the library in heaven. That's my idea of heaven, is a perfect library which has all the lost scrolls of Alexandria and the libraries of all the British Library combined with the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library of the Alexandrian Library in Egypt, and the national libraries of all the world put together, with a special device whereby you can translate them all immediately into your telepathic self-consciousness. Even a book by Andrew Collins here, who's an esoteric archaeologist, Gateway to Atlantis. Obviously this guy was, like me, interested in, he was an omnivore, to find Andrew Collins, who I've met, and who's a friend of, colleagues of mine. The mark of a true professor is that they're omnivorous. They love learning so much. They will look at everything. It doesn't mean they're going to agree with it. It doesn't mean he believes, every word Andrew Collins writes, but he will look at the evidence. He'll look at it. He also spoke Turkish, so he had quite a lot of Turkish works here. Anyway, I wish I could spend, go into detail on the whole thing. This is interesting. This is a map of, Central Europe, showing the kinds of archaeological evidence there is for the Central European peoples. Now, what people don't realise is the Druids and the Celts were coming down the Danube. A lot of what we call Thrace, what is now Bulgaria, had very strong Druid settlements, and we know these influenced Orpheus, who was a Thracian, a seer, a shaman, and he was coming out of that old European civilization, and he brought teachings into Greece that became philosophy. It was Orpheus that was the traditional founder of the schools that later became worked over and became the Pythagorean schools. You need to read Surah's great masterpiece on the great initiates of history. He has a wonderful chapter on Orpheus. He has a wonderful chapter on Pythagoras, and then a brilliant chapter on Plato. Although, to be honest, I think his chapter on Plato is a bit thin. But then, he was limited by space. I think if I meet Surah in the Heavenly Library, I'm going to grumble and say he didn't do Plato enough justice. It's fashionable to bash Plato, but actually he was an initiate of that ancient old European school, and he loved the goddess. He knew the wisdom of the divine feminine in Diotimus' story, transmitted by Socrates. So, he's part of the same team, so to speak. There's also something interesting about Aristotle, who was Plato's disciple and student, who was also a goddess devotee, although, again, he had his cultural overlays. All sages have their own cultural biases, just as Muhammad did, or Jesus. But what Aristotle did when he was called by the Amphictyony of Delphi, there was a tremendous fire there in the 4th century BC, and all the records burned. So they asked Aristotle, who was the wisest of all the Greeks at the time, to come in and try and reconstruct, to interview people, to try and remake the catalogue of what was there. And it's one of the most intriguing episodes in Aristotle's life. He was invited by the authorities of Delphi to go and reconstruct their lost library. I mean, how tragic it would be if this wonderful library in Çanakkale ever, here's a book on the Celts in German by, he was obviously a great fan of the Druids, old Manfred. Sadly, I never met him. He died before I got there. But anyway, that's a little glimpse. I want to move on and look at another of these albums because there's so much I want to share with you that I'm going to run out of time. This, I think, is worth sharing with you. This is in Saint-Germain in Paris. Now, Saint-Germain is the Museum of Prehistory for France. And it was founded in the 19th century by the Emperor Louis Napoleon, who was a fan of the Celts. And he wanted to see Celtic wisdom reconstructed. And he sponsored the creation of this great museum, which was housing finds that were beginning to be made all over France of the ancient times. And many of these are very famous. These sort of plump women are typical. They were goddess worshippers, the ancient inhabitants of Gaul, and they morphed and eventually became the Celts that we know and love of Gaul. And this is one of the, this is made of, I think it's ivory. It's a beautiful head of a young girl, essentially, with a beautiful hairstyle. The original is here in this museum at Saint-Germain. Now, the museum itself has amazing finds, which there won't be time to show you everything. I'll try and show you the highlights. From the very earliest inhabitants of Gaul, who made these amazing hand axes, each of them masterpieces, practical things. They would be on wood held in by thongs. These are some of the places, the caves in the Dordogne, in Allier, in Ardèche, all over France, particularly in the Dordogne region, which of course is where the great finds of the Lascaux caves were made. There were also caves down here in the Pyrenees at Foix, which is where the Cathar region was. This is a famous site where there's a sorcerer chap, Les Aizis. Some of these are still open. You can visit these caves. Others are closed because of, tourists make the things deteriorate. So I went through this museum with devotion, obviously, finding all kinds of goodies to explore and photographing them all, as is my wont. Here's a famous horse's head, the original of which is in this museum at Saint-Germain. This is a very famous image, showing the sophistication of the artists of these ancient Gauls from prehistory. I call their religion the shamanic tradition that later morphed into druidry. There's a direct line of descent from these early cave-dwelling peoples who were making art, the Magdalenian culture and so on, right down on into the Gauls. And there's a continuity. There's no doubt about it. People that built Karnak. And you see, France isn't just, Druids weren't just in Brittany, that's a myth. No, there are dolmens and stone, sacred sites all over France, as far as the Pyrenees down south. Most French villages have dolmens and so on nearby, still to this day. Some have been incorporated into churches. You might find them inside a church even. There's a wonderful image of a bull. These people were artists already. You can see early Picasso at work. This is interesting because it's Saint-Germain's gardens. And what I want to tell you about this place is that it was the home of the Stuart monarch in exile. After the rightful king of Britain, many would say, was kicked out of London by his son-in-law, William, and his ungrateful daughter, Mary, in the name of their Protestant faith, James had to flee, and he came to France with his court. He became more and more religious, and the king housed him in this amazing palace called Saint-Germain, which is on the outskirts of Paris. Here's some books in the bookshop here. And it was where he lived. And right up until the French Revolution, the descendants were very close to it. The descendants of the Stuarts were allowed to still stay there. The monarchs regarded them as the rightful, throne holders of Britain. Unfortunately, they never regained the throne, although the current monarch, Elizabeth II, is, a relative of James. And, the Jacobite cause was associated with this place, Saint-Germain. What's interesting is it now houses the archaeological collection of France's antiquities. Seems an appropriate kind of thing. There's a wonderful church in the village or little town of Saint-Germain. This is the front door of the Musée des Antiquités Nationales. It's a big thing. This is like the British Museum for France. Anyone that's in France should go here. It's just a short, train ride from Paris. This is the church of Saint-Germain, which is beautiful. It's very tasteful, typical, mixture of beauty and solemnity of Catholic architecture at its best. And this is where King James himself would have worshipped. He became a Catholic. He'd always been a Catholic, but he just became more so. He was a friend of Sir Isaac Newton, who dedicated Principia Mathematica to him. And James was the first monarch in British history that gave the Quakers freedom. Up until then, the Quakers had been persecuted. So James was a tolerant universalist kind of Catholic. Don't believe all the Protestant fanatical press against him. It's all made up nonsense. He was a far more intelligent man than the kind of mercantile capitalists that seized the throne from him, brought in the Bank of England and redefined what Britishness was all about as being sort of, violent, the ability to project armies and violence wherever they wanted. James was the last of the old idea that the duty of the monarch is to actually care for the subjects under God and to look after them. He issued an edict of toleration that granted toleration to people of all religions in Britain. The first time this was ever done. And really, I'm not convinced that William and Mary's seizure of the throne was progress. Seems to me it was regress. It's also after him that New York is named. And he was a friend of the Comte de Saint-Germain, who's one of the great esotericists of European history. And we know that the Count de Saint-Germain came to visit James at this court, which was taking place in what is now this great museum. And I'd gone for two reasons. One was to see the museum, but also to honour King James and the Comte de Saint-Germain, who's one of my kind of intellectual mentors or heroes. And really to lament the dumbing down of Britain that's come since then. This is the great palace or museum from the outside. And you can see it's huge, right? And more, this ought to be known about more in British history, because this is also part of our history. There's the whole thing. There was going to be an exhibition the day after I got there, an outdoor concert playing, so they were erecting the seats in the grounds. Anyway, so Saint-Germain, definitely go if you have a chance. It's in the middle of a huge park, worth visiting. And there's the building, which is houses not just the museum, but also libraries and archives on the history of archaeology in the area. Unfortunately, I couldn't get access to that. So that's another very exciting album. Let me see a couple of others I want to share. So there's lots shot around France, and that's this is Clos Luce, which is where Leonardo da Vinci lived, and it's just home to him from 1516 to 1519. That's a picture of me on the battlements overlooking it, my friend Geoffrey Gale. Here is the house, which is really a huge, like, big, big house, not just a little one. And he had the run of it. It was where his friend, King Francis I, who'd given him shelter in France, grew up as a childhood home with his sister, Margaret, who later married a king of the Pyrenees. And Margaret of Angoulême was a great scholar in her own right. She and Francis grew up in this very house. And when Leonardo came to stay in France, he was given this house by his grateful employer, Francis. And he had several rooms as bedrooms and as dining rooms, but also as art studio. And I will show you some of the pictures because they're very interesting historically. And when I went there, I had a very strange series of experiences, which I'll tell you at the end. The grounds are very beautiful. I mean, obviously Leonardo had some help. He was quite an old, frail man at the time, so he wasn't working completely alone. I mean, he had a cook and people to help with take care of his practical needs. In the basement of this is a museum dedicated to Leonardo's inventions. So there are working scale models of all his various inventions in the basement, which are fascinating to see and I mean, they work. Now the thing is, he had to invent a lot of military equipment. His instinct was for the arts. He loved art, painting he's famous for, architecture as well. But he had to earn a living, and it was difficult to earn a living as an artist. So he had to then go and work for warlords like the Sforza dynasty in Milan or Cesare Borgia, who ran the papal armies. And here he invented a kind of machine gun type thing. He invented a helicopter as a military machine, so you could go up. This is another kind of cannon that would fire lots of bullets. And he was forced to invent all these weapons and military inventions. He was the first to think up of a tank. Anyway, what I realised going here and having this is an invention he made to do with water, I believe. Oh no, this is some kind of, again, a military thing. Is that in his day, the greatest minds often had to prostitute themselves to the military. They had to work for, military capitalism. And it's the same now. Our greatest minds on the planet are still having to... that was a car. He invented the first car. The steam hammer. Anyway, it's worth going. If you get a chance to come to Amboise in France, go and see all the things he invented, which have their, their models here. And let's see if we can get back upstairs to the bedroom area. We can see where he died, because I want to show you the bed that he died in. This is all the models in the basement, fascinating though they are. I mean, there's too much to show you here. Huge detail, you'll have to go yourself. There's the kind of tank thing he invented, which has these wheels inside, and it had cannon projecting, so the soldiers would be inside, they could move it around and fire grape shot at their enemies.